War is hell. It always has been, and it always will be. But beyond all of the death counts and statistics, it's a very real human story. One that until modern times didn't really get told. The question that we have is, did ancient soldiers suffer the psychological malady that we now call PTSD? It's often thought as a modern diagnosis, formally defined only in 1980. Yet references of the unseen scars of war appear across the broad sweep of ancient history. From Mesopotamian tablets, to biblical laws, to the Greek epics and Roman biographies, we find more than a few hints that the warriors of antiquity were not immune to what we'd recognize as combat trauma. Now, the topic itself demands a bit of critical thinking. We have to be careful not to project modern medical labels too eagerly onto the past. Ancient cultures had their own ways of interpreting and coping with the soldiers' distress. But at the same time, human nature as a whole has not changed by a huge degree over millennia. The human mind is the human mind, and thus is the human heart. And so by examining the primary sources close to the time, we can uncover a few anecdotes and clues, whether it be a Greek hoplite struck blind after battle with no wound, a Roman general plagued by horrific dreams of his past battles, and even ancient armies devising rituals to purge what they called the blood guilt of combat. And so in a spiritual successor, or perhaps a spiritual prologue to our Did Medieval Soldiers Get PTSD video, today we dive into that very topic in an ancient form. Now, before we do get into it, I'd like to welcome you to the channel if you're a newcomer, and if you haven't clicked that subscribe button yet, perhaps you'd consider doing so. This video, along with all of the other videos on this channel, all the playlists, everything that is there, is completely mid-roll free. You won't get any ads from start to finish, so you won't get interrupted and you can enjoy the whole thing. Now, this is because we are supported by the kind members on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who check out the merch store, and the occasional donation through the Super Thanks and PayPal link. But most of all, your word of mouth is most important. Tell your friends and share on social media platforms, things like that. But also just like, comment, subscribe, and hype the video. Helps with the algorithm. Now, with all that being said, thank you in advance, and we can begin. And of course, to begin, we have to clarify the terms, don't we? So, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is defined in the modern vernacular as a mental health condition triggered by experiencing or witnessing a terrifying event, often life-threatening. It doesn't have to be war. It could be any kind of terrible thing that somebody has went through. Common symptoms include intrusive memories or flashbacks of the trauma, nightmares, hypervigilance, that's constantly feeling on edge, looking over your shoulder, that kind of thing, paranoia, avoidance of reminders of the event, emotional numbness or depression, or just in general severe anxiety. Now, this criteria was formally codified only in recent decades, largely in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, when returning veterans' psychological struggles forced a recognition of PTSD in 1980. But the basic phenomenon, the survivor's mind and body reliving the terror long after the danger has gone away, well, that's been observed for centuries, just under different names. And so historically, each era coined its own terms. For the psychological injuries of war in particular, we had, in particular in World War I, the term shell shock, that shaking, startled daze of combat veterans, as if it was caused by the exploding artillery shells, which in themselves were kind of a new thing for people to be exposed to. In World War II, it was often combat fatigue, or battle neurosis. The American Civil War doctors spoke of soldier's heart or nostalgia for a condition combining palpitations and homesickness. These earlier labels reflect an evolving theory: physical concussion, exhaustion, homesickness, but all grappled with the same core reality, and that was that some soldiers carried enduring mental scars from battle. But if we step back even further, did the ancient people notice similar patterns? Ancient civilizations obviously lacked the psychiatric framework that we have today, that goes without saying. They didn't write clinical case notes using terms like disorder or trauma, but instead, they often explained strange or dysfunctional behavior in moral, religious, or even supernatural terms. A warrior breaking down or crying or withdrawing from society might more so be seen as a curse by the gods, afflicted by an evil spirit, or simply, in rather unfeeling terms, they'd call him a coward. But despite all this, ancient observers were keenly attuned to human experience. Many were excellent storytellers and philosophers who described human fears with grief and rich detail. And by reading their works closely, we can certainly find descriptions that resonate strongly with what we now identify as post-traumatic stress symptoms. But we should also consider that not every era or culture would have equally high rates of PTSD. Psychological trauma depends on many factors: the nature and duration of combat, the society's support systems, even how acceptable it is for a warrior to acknowledge fear or weakness. So, some scholars rightly caution that assuming PTSD had to exist in the past is a little bit too simplistic. Perhaps ancient warriors were more prepared for brutality due to their harsh upbringings, or those severely affected might not survive, or would simply be shunned, leaving fewer records of their plight, no stories left to tell. But on the other hand, there are the fundamentals of just being human: the fear of death, attachment to comrades, guilt over killing. They seem to have not changed. War in antiquity was up close and personal, hand-to-hand combat with swords, spears. If you were lucky, you'd be away at a distance with an arrow, with a bow and arrow rather, that is until the cavalry come and charge at you. Sometimes it could even get down to fist fights and all the rest, men literally choking each other to death on the ground. Of course, soldiers saw and felt the blood of both enemies and friends, so it would be surprising if no one had lasting nightmares after enduring such an event. One can only think about that. So with these things in mind, our approach will be to let these sources speak for themselves as much as possible. We'll focus on primary accounts, that is, historians, poets, dramatists, even the occasional soldier themselves. And without stretching too much, we'll look for signs of psychological trauma. But when we do encounter those signs, we'll look at them carefully and acknowledge a cultural lens from which they were described. Well, let's go through chronologically first. Well, the earliest known writings to hint at war-related trauma come from the ancient Near East, particularly Mesopotamia, that cradle of civilization, and also the cradle of constant warfare, unfortunately for them. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia written in cuneiform script include what modern scholars recognize as medical texts and incantations. Among these are descriptions of afflictions by soldiers that sound startlingly familiar. A recent study of Assyrian cuneiform texts dating between roughly 1300 and 600 BCE suggests that Assyrian soldiers were very well aware of people exhibiting what we would call these post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. The soldiers were part of the Assyrian army, a force engaged in near constant campaigns of conquest across Near East. According to researchers who compiled and translated the tablets, Some passages described warriors who returned from battle, complaining of seeing ghosts or hearing spirits talking to them. But crucially, these apparitions are said to be ghosts of people that the soldiers had killed in combat, which certainly makes things a little different. In the Assyrian worldview, if a man kept seeing the face of someone that he killed, it wasn't an inner flashback or guilt, but it was an actual angry ghost coming back to torment him. No one can imagine an Assyrian veteran walking through his village at night, convinced that the angry soul of an enemy lurks in the shadow, whispering curses. Vengeance. Well, such descriptions, I don't think anyone can argue against them strongly resembling the hallucinations of intrusive memories reported by some modern combat veterans. For example, a veteran of hand-to-hand fighting might in waking nightmares see the faces of those he killed over and over again. The Assyrian texts go further too, to record sleep disturbances and even depression in these soldiers. An Assyrian healer might note that a certain fighter cannot sleep, or when he does, he has terrible nightmares, and is listless or low in spirit during the day, unable to find joy after returning from war. But then there's the next question. How did the ancient Mesopotamians attempt to treat this haunting? They had to do something, right? Of course, their understanding was framed not in medical terms, but rather spiritual. The condition was often attributed to malevolent spirits of the unburied or vengeful dead, and therefore healing would involve exorcisms or purification rituals. Priests or healers recited incantations to appease or expel the ghost. In some cases, the prescribed remedy might be to make offerings to the gods or the troubled spirit. For instance, a ritual burial by proxy for the enemy's ghost, or amulets to ward off the spectre. Pretty much they recognized the soldier's suffering as very real and serious, even if they explained it as a supernatural attack rather than an internal psychological trauma. And this shows a key point, I think. Ancient societies acknowledged the invisible wounds of war, but they viewed them through a prism of religion and even a little superstition. But the fact is that a pattern was observed, soldiers overwhelmed by guilt and fear manifesting as ghostly visions, and that speaks to the universality of the experience. It's just that the hypothesis is a little different. Well, turning to another ancient Near Eastern culture, in the Old Testament, we see some insight into how the early Israelites thought about the psychological toll of killing. Now, while the Bible does not explicitly narrate a case of a soldier with nightmares, it does contain laws and narratives that imply an understanding of war's emotional and spiritual burden. For example, the book of Numbers, chapter 31, there is a striking command given to Israelite soldiers who have returned from battle, that they must stay outside the camp for a week, purify themselves and their captives, and cleanse with water on the 3rd and 7th days, before rejoining with the polite society. Well, the impurity was likely considered a spiritual one. In fact, contact with death was a defilement in Jewish law, which, well, that makes war kind of difficult, doesn't it? But we can also read it quite symbolically. It gave soldiers a structured transition period to kind of decompress and process what they had done before going home to their families. It's as if the community recognized that a man who killed in battle should not immediately walk back into normal life without doing some reflection and ritual to debrief and reset himself, kind of shake off or even, well, wash off the literal blood from his clothes and hands. And then we have Deuteronomy 28. An even more humane insight appears in instructions given before battle. The officers are told to proclaim, quote, "What man is there who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house, lest he make the heart of his brethren melt as his heart. In other words, a soldier who was terrified, perhaps paralyzed by fear, was given official permission to bow out of combat and return home, rather than demoralize the others. This remarkable rule acknowledges that intense fear can grip a person in war to the point of impairing them, and rather than punish such a man, the law suggests compassion and a practical desire to keep the army's morale steady. Well, while this is about acute fear before or during the battle, not long-term trauma afterwards, it does show a timeless truth that not everyone has the stomach for it, and ancient leaders knew that some minds would be unable to cope. But of course, once again, who is going to stand among all of their peers in their village and put their hand up and expose themselves as, well, what everyone is going to pretty much view as a coward? Let that one person go home while everybody else goes and does the dirty work. Kinda hard to walk around the village market with that reputation. In any case, we even find narratives and hints of psychological struggles. Consider the figure of King Saul in the books of Samuel. Saul is a warrior king who fights in many battles, and after a particularly harrowing series of events, including warfare and personal betrayal, Saul is described as being tormented by an evil spirit, causes bouts of rage and depression. He becomes paranoid, he falls into despair, and he requires the young David to play the lyre to soothe him. Some have speculated that Saul's deteriorating mental state might reflect the strain of constant warfare and guilt. He orders massacres, he faces defeat. Well, ultimately, it leads to his tragic death on the battlefield, not by being slain by an enemy, but by taking his own life. The biblical writers attribute his madness to God's displeasure. But we can look a bit deeper in hindsight. You could also view Saul as a case of a warrior king cracking under the added psychological pressure, a very human portrayal amid theological frame. Well, let's turn to ancient Greece now. We step into a culture that actually left behind a vast swath of literature grappling with war's impact on humans that we're quite lucky to still have. The Greeks of the classical period, that is the 5th to 4th centuries BCE, were frequently at war. You had the Persian Wars, you had the Peloponnesian War, and then when the Greeks weren't busy fighting the Persians, they were busy fighting themselves in endless city-state conflicts. Many citizens were soldiers at some point. It's just the way it was. Well, Greek writings, from epic poetry to drama and history, provide some of the most vivid illustrations of what we can recognize now as psychological trauma, even if couched in mythical dramatic terms. So let's explore the Greek perspectives by looking at 3 areas: the mythic heroes of epic poetry, the tragedies of Athens, and the historical accounts by authors like Herodotus that recorded real incidents of what might be called battle shock. Start with the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Though not eyewitness history, no one's arguing for that point, but there were certainly foundational cultural tales that reflected Greek experiences and values around warfare. They were composed around the 8th century BCE, drawing on even earlier oral traditions, and would have been familiar to every Greek in classical times. These epics do not diagnose PTSD, of course, but they paint the emotional lives of warriors in a way that later readers and even some modern scholars have interpreted as remarkably insightful about war trauma. Take Achilles in the Iliad, for example. Achilles is the greatest warrior at the siege of Troy, nearly invincible on the battlefield. Yet his story is essentially one of psychological crisis. Early in the epic, Achilles is offended and angered by his commander Agamemnon's disrespect, a comrade in arms conflict, I suppose, and he withdraws from battle not out of fear but out of moral injury. His honor had been wounded. And so when his beloved comrade Patroclus is killed in battle while Achilles is sulking, Achilles experiences an explosion of grief and guilt. His reaction is extreme. He weeps, then his sorrow turns to uncontrollable wrath. He rejoins the fight with a single-minded fury to avenge his friend Patroclus, displaying a kind of berserker behavior that might today be recognized as an acute stress reaction or survivor's guilt-fueled rage. Achilles' defining rampage culminates in him desecrating the corpse of Hector, the enemy champion. He drags Hector's body from his chariot repeatedly. This act shocked the ancient audiences. It violates the norms of respect for the dead. Why would Achilles, once noble, once following the conventions of war, suddenly do something so savage? Of course, one interpretation is that Achilles has been psychologically pushed beyond his normal limits by the loss of his friend and the cumulative brutality of war. His humanity has eroded to the point where he's described as savage and inhuman in his anger. Some modern commentators, like psychologist Jonathan Shea in his book Achilles in Vietnam, 1994, have drawn parallels between Achilles' mental state and that of modern soldiers who lose comrades. He argues Achilles shows signs of combat trauma and moral injury. Betrayal by leadership and grief drive him into a state of lethal rage and alienation from normal virtues, much as some of Vietnam veterans described feeling. The rules went out the window after one of your friends died, leading to excessive and vengeful violence. Well, eventually in the Iliad, Achilles returns to humanity only when he meets King Priam, who begs for Hector's body. In a profoundly emotional scene, Achilles breaks down weeping with his enemy's father, sharing the sorrow. Both of them had lost someone important to them. It's as if only an empathetic confrontation with grief allows him to begin healing from his psychological wound. Achilles' story, while mythical, suggests the Greeks understood that even the strongest warrior is psychologically vulnerable, and that intense grief and rage from war can drive one to irrational cruelty. But now consider Odysseus, the crafty hero of the Odyssey. If Achilles represents the trauma of war's violence, Odysseus represents the trauma of returning home. The Odyssey is fundamentally about a warrior's struggle to reintegrate into normal life after 20 years of continuous strife and troubles. 10 years of war at Troy, and then 10 years of dangerous wandering. Throughout his journey, Odysseus is depicted as weary, yearning for home and emotionally scarred. In one famous episode, Odysseus is shipwrecked in a foreign land, and a bard sings about the Trojan War. Hearing the tale of his own exploits, Odysseus cannot contain his emotions. He covers his face and silently weeps as memories overwhelm him. And that's a powerful portrayal of a veteran triggered into grief by reminders of combat, much like a war veteran today might be moved to tears or distress by a war story or song. Once Odysseus finally arrives home in Ithaca, he doesn't bounce joyously into domestic life. Instead, he initially sneaks in disguised, ever suspicious and cautious like a special operations soldier still in mission mode, and he's unable to trust a single person. He famously has difficulty revealing his identity, even to his loyal wife Penelope at first. And when he does that, it is with continued violence, slaughtering the interloping suitors in his hall in a final bloody confrontation. One might interpret Odysseus's homecoming as a study in the combat hypervigilance and difficulty adjusting. He has been in survival mode for so long that he meets any perceived threat with the deadliest of force. Only after he has purged the threat and proven his identity can peace finally return. In later tradition, some stories even suggest Odysseus found it hard to settle and eventually went on another exile, a hint that restlessness of the war veteran could never fully leave him. And again, while couched in myth, Odysseus' tale captures the profound challenge of transitioning from the battlefield back to the normal life. And that is something that any soldier will attest to. Well, the Athenians of the 5th century BCE also did something quite extraordinary. They regularly gathered to watch tragedies, plays that often dealt with the darkest consequences of war and violence. Many Greek tragedies were written by playwrights who themselves actually fought in wars. Achilles, for example, fought at the Battle of Marathon, the great victory over Persia in 490, and supposedly said that his gravestone should remember him as a veteran, not a playwright. It's no surprise, then, that war's psychological aftermath appears as a theme on the Attic stage. One of the most striking examples is Sophocles' tragedy Ajax, performed around 444 BCE. Now, Ajax is one of the Greek heroes of the Trojan War, only second to Achilles in prowess. And Sophocles imagines what happens to him after the war, when honor and purpose have become somewhat muddled. In the play, the Trojan War has ended, and Ajax feels deeply humiliated when Achilles' armor is awarded to Odysseus instead of to him. This perceived betrayal and slighting by his commanders drives Ajax into mental collapse. Enraged and dishonored, Ajax plans to kill his Greek comrades in revenge. But before he can do so, the goddess Athena, in the play's divine intervention, strikes him with a delusional form of madness. Ajax, in a frenzied state, slaughters a herd of livestock, believing them to be his fellow Greek officers. When he comes to his senses and realizes that he's butchered innocent animals in a hallucination, Ajax is overcome with shame and despair. The great warrior, who had survived countless battles unscathed, cannot survive the psychological shame and loss of identity he now experiences. Ajax ultimately takes his own life, falling on his sword. A tragedy arc, eerily foreshadowing what we now know as a pattern. A decorated veteran, post-war, suffering a mix of moral injury, rage, and possibly hallucinations, a psychotic break, eventually culminating in the ending of his own life. Modern audiences can recognize in Ajax a tragedy of early portrait of a warrior who snaps after the fighting is over. Sophocles portrays Ajax sympathetically, not as a monster, but as a fundamentally honorable man undone by unbearable inner turmoil, and not to mention a complete lack of support. The chorus of sailors and his wife Tecmesa in the play express concern and try to reach out to him, but the stigma and gravity of his madness isolate Ajax. His story would resonate with any modern clinician familiar with veterans getting PTSD and having these kinds of issues, eventually taking their own lives if it comes to that. While the Greeks attributed Ajax's initial frenzy to Athena's curse, it's quite clear that Sophocles is also saying, look, even the mightiest can fall to invisible wounds. And how exactly are we meant to treat that? In fact, the latter half of the play debates whether Ajax deserves burial and honor after him taking his own life, indicating a community struggling with how to honor a war hero's ignominious psychological collapse. Ancient Athens thus used the tragedy as a way to cathartically explore the traumas of war, perhaps to instill empathy and caution in their citizen soldiers too. And another relevant tragedy is that of Heracles, also known as Heracles Furens, the madness of Heracles. This one was written by Euripides. In this play, the hero Heracles, also known as Hercules, famous for his strength and his 12 labors, returns home after a final warlike mission only to suffer a sudden bout of divine madness. In a cruel twist orchestrated by the goddess Hera, Heracles, in a deranged fury, kills his own wife and children, mistaking them for enemies. When he wakes up from this murderous trance and sees what he has done, Heracles is devastated. He is on the verge of ending it all, out of overwhelming guilt and horror at what he'd done. But what's striking is how this mythic story mirrors the pattern of combat veterans' violent flashback or uncontrolled rage episodes, followed by profound remorse. In the play, Heracles' friend Theseus arrives and ultimately talks him out of doing the wrong thing, offering support and framing the madness as an external force. Quote, "Some god or some sickness struck you. It was not truly you." Theseus essentially helps Heracles see that he should not blame himself to the point of self-destruction, and he promises Heracles purification and refuge in Athens to start anew. This resolution carries a message. Even a hero can be mentally wounded and do terrible things under that influence. But with compassion and rituals of purification, even he can be saved. The ancient audience would have recognized that war, Heracles had been at war just prior, by the way, brings a miasma, a kind of pollution that can drive a man insane, and that the community has a duty to cleanse and support him afterwards. It's moving that an ancient play identifies social support and absolution as the remedy for a warrior's crushing guilt. In modern terms, we might call that a proto-form of therapy, reframing the trauma as something that happened to the veteran, not solely by him, and providing a path back to a normal life. Of course, Greek tragedy is filled with other, more subtle reflections of war trauma. Achilles' play The Persians, 472 BC, is presented from the perspective of the defeated Persian court after Xerxes' failed invasion of Greece. It describes the Persian elders, and even Xerxes himself, reeling in shock and humiliation after the disaster. Xerxes arrives on the stage as a broken man, clothes torn, unable to speak coherently at first, essentially traumatized by the crushing defeat and loss of his army. While this is a national trauma, not an individual PTSD case, it does show the Greeks acknowledge the psychological impact of war even on their enemies. Likewise, Euripides' Trojan Women portrays the survivors of a captured city, the women of Troy, in the throes of grief, despair, and hopelessness after witnessing the destruction of their home. Though not about soldiers, it powerfully conveys post-war trauma from the more civilian perspective. And, well, that's not something that you see too often, of course. Well, the fact that the Athenians watched these plays, which unsparingly depict the misery following war, suggests they were quite conscious that war left deep emotional scars alongside the glories. Well, let's move on a little bit beyond the myth and drama, if it's all the same to you, because we have actual historical accounts from antiquity that describe rather peculiar reactions of soldiers in war. Let's look at Herodotus first. Once again, grains of salt with him. They call him the father of history, and he wrote the Histories in the 5th century BCE, basically documenting the Greco-Persian wars and a few other tales of the ancient world. He actually had an account of the Battle of Marathon in 490, where he records one of the earliest clear references to combat-induced psychological injury. Now, if you're not aware of it, the Battle of Marathon was a momentous fight, and the Athenians came out on the better side of it, defeating a Persian invasion force against great odds. But amid all the valor, amid all the bravery and all the rest, Herodotus notes a strange prodigy that occurred. An Athenian warrior named Epizelus, son of Cophagarus, was in the thick of fight, behaving bravely, when suddenly he went blind. What's remarkable is that Epizelus was not hit by any weapon. There was no arrow, no sword or spear that touched him. He simply lost his sight in the heat of battle. And this blindness persisted for the rest of his life. Herodotus then relays Epizelus' own account of what he experienced in that moment. Epizelus reported that he saw a giant apparition of a warrior with a huge beard in front of him on the battlefield. This phantom warrior according to Epizelus, praised him, and instead struck down the main man beside him. Right after witnessing this, all of a sudden everything went black. Epizelus couldn't see a thing. Now this tale is pretty fascinating, both to historians but also to physicians. It strongly suggests that Epizelus suffered what we would now call hysterical blindness or conversion disorder triggered by extreme trauma. A psychological reaction where the mind under unbearable stress or shock disables a bodily function, in this case sight, with very little physical cause. Epizelus' vision of a giant warrior ghost could well have been a hallucinatory flash at the moment of overwhelming terror. Essentially, his mind's way of making sense of a chaotic, lethal situation, well, followed by a psychogenic blindness as his mind just shut down complete visual input at least, to protect him from seeing any further horrors. And there is a modern parallel that exists. There are documented cases of soldiers in the First and Second World War who went blind or deaf with no injury, but more due to acute stress. Herodotus did not have our terminology, of course, but he faithfully recorded what must have sounded like a miraculous or eerie event. He calls it a prodigy, in Greek, teras, meaning a wonder or sign from the gods. The Greeks might have seen Epizelus as struck by a god or in shock from seeing a deity or spirit on the battlefield. Notably, the interpretation given, a ghostly giant killing the man next to him, resembles those Mesopotamian accounts of ghosts, but Herodotus doesn't really editorialize that much. He leaves it as, quote, "This is what I heard he said happened." In any case, you must imagine poor old Epizelus afterwards, a healthy young man, turned permanently blind in one of the most celebrated battles of antiquity. He likely became a living reminder in Athens that war could bring about inexplicable afflictions. We hear little else of his fate, but presumably he was taken care of as a disabled veteran. Many today cite Epizelus as the earliest recorded case of wartime post-traumatic stress, and it's compelling evidence, too, that Greek observers, when confronted with a veteran who had a psychological breakdown, decided to note it for posterity. Herodotus also hints at other psychological aspects of war. He describes battle where panic spreads through armies. In fact, the word panic actually originates from the god Pan, who supposedly could instill irrational terror in crowds. Think about it. Panic. The more you know. Well, at the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks later said that Pan had lent his aid by causing a panic among the Persian troops. We could read this as a mythologizing of what was likely a psychological phenomenon. One side broke and fled in fear as things turned against them, and the Greeks, rather than describing the Persians as simply afraid, attributed this to the divine influence. Again, a divine explanation masks a keen awareness of mass fear responses in battle. Greek medical writers of the time too, such as Hippocrates, rarely mention specific war neuroses, but they do discuss extreme emotional stress. The Hippocratic treatises talk about phobias and how fright can cause physical symptoms, and they also recognize that the mind and body are linked in illness. One could imagine that physicians encountered veterans with lingering maladies. That's what we might label as psychosomatic, like constant fatigue or heart palpitations, this kind of thing, and might attribute these to humoral imbalances triggered by exertion and fear. For example, an ancient doctor might say a soldier's black bile humor was agitated by seeing bloodshed, causing melancholia, or in more modern terms, depression. And even without surviving texts explicitly saying so, such frameworks, we can say they likely existed. Well, let's move on to Rome. We find a society that idealized discipline, endurance, and, of course, that stoic warrior spirit. The Roman legions were famed for their ironclad training and organization, and Roman cultural values praised the soldier who was dutiful, fearless, and most of all, loyal. As for cowardice, you could expect that to be harshly punished. For instance, units that fled battle might undergo decimation, that is, the execution of every 10th man, as a brutal lesson. Given this ethos, one might assume that the Romans would rarely acknowledge psychological trauma in their ranks, and indeed Roman historians and writers did not often dwell on soldiers trembling at the thought of old battles. That would have been an uncomfortable topic for a culture of such martial pride. However, if we read between the lines and gather some later accounts, there is a picture that emerges of Roman soldiers being as human as anyone else. They too could break down under stress, or carry heavy emotional burdens from their campaigns, and in a few cases, Roman authors explicitly described what the classic PTSD symptoms looked like in their contemporaries. One remarkable account comes to us from Plutarch, a Greek biographer writing under the Roman Empire, as around the late 1st to early 2nd century CE. In his Life of Marius, Plutarch chronicles the career of Gaius Marius, a great Roman general and statesman of the late 2nd century BCE. Marius had a long and bloody career, quite frankly. He defeated invading Germanic tribes in battles often involving horrific, one-sided slaughter. He fought in civil wars, and even at one point he was exiled and endured much hardship before returning to seize power in Rome. In Plutarch's narrative of Marius' final years, we find an astonishing description of a battle-hardened general, essentially suffering a mental breakdown. After Marius turns 70 and finds himself embattled in yet another civil conflict, this time facing his rival Sulla, Plutarch says that Marius became exhausted and haunted by his past experiences. The text describes Marius as, quote, worn out with toils, deluged with anxieties. He could not sustain his spirit. He was facing the prospect of more conflict, and having been through so many wars, he began to feel overwhelming dread at the thought of another round of it. In Plutarch's words, Marius's spirit shook within him, as he again faced terrors known by experience to be dreadful. Now that phrase is telling, isn't it? Marius's fear was not of the unknown, but precisely of what he knew war entailed, and how it was going to make him feel, how it was going to hit everyone. This seasoned general, who had seen and survived everything from barbarian hordes to political massacres, was now tortured by memory and anticipation. Plutarch goes on. Marius, quote, fell into a state of dreadful despair, and was a prey to nightly terrors and harassing dreams. And here we have, once again, plainly stated, a case of a veteran with chronic nightmares about his battles. Marius would wake from sleep in panic. He reportedly kept having a particular dream or auditory hallucination of a voice repeating a line. Dreadful indeed is the lion's lair, even if it's empty, which apparently symbolized that even when immediate threats were gone, his mind remained trapped in fear. To escape these waking nightmares, Marius started to drink heavily, at odd hours too, hoping to induce sleep without dreams. This self-medication with alcohol is also tragically familiar, I think. Well, plenty of people who are having these kinds of issues, a coping mechanism of sorts. Plutarch basically paints a textbook picture, I think. Insomnia, nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression, and substance abuse, all in a Roman general from the 1st century BCE. Marius's condition worsened when news came that his enemy Sulla was nearing Rome. The combination of his psychological strain and perhaps physical illness just proved to be too much, and Plutarch reports that Marius took to his bed and died a few days later, seemingly from fever exacerbated by stress. Some versions even say that Marius is feverish in delirium at the end, imagining himself back on the battlefield, shouting out commands, a haunting image of a warrior whose mind cannot escape the war even at the moment of death. This account from Plutarch is pretty valuable. You see, it strips away the usual Roman facade of invincibility, and it shows a venerable Roman hero in a very vulnerable light. It suggests that Romans did recognize such phenomena, at least in hindsight or private whispers. It may be no coincidence that Plutarch was writing in Greek for a somewhat Greek-educated audience. Perhaps a Roman writer would not have emphasized Marius's breakdown in such open terms. But still, the information had to come from somewhere, likely from anecdotes preserved about Marius's behavior. In any case, it's a pretty classic case of late-onset PTSD. After a whole lifetime of keeping up that veneer, trying to hold it together, the stiff upper lip sort of thing, well, all that cognitive trauma finally caught up with him. Poor Marius. You must feel sorry for these sorts of people, right? It's not good to hear any of this. Well, another example from Roman times is recorded by the historian Appian in the 2nd century CE. Appian, in writing about the civil wars around the time of Augustus, that is the end of the Roman Republic, tells of a veteran named Cestius Macedonicus. During the chaos of those civil wars, when Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, was capturing a town that Cestius lived in, this old legionary could not bear to face what was coming. Rather than be caught in another bloody sack of a city, Cestius barricaded himself in his house, set it on fire, and burned himself alive. Well, this was noted by Appian presumably because of its shocking nature, and we can interpret Cestius' actions in a couple of ways. Perhaps it was a calculated choice to avoid capture and humiliation. Things like this did happen in antiquity for reasons of honor and practicality. But perhaps, as one military historian has speculated, Cestius had witnessed such horrors in previous wars, that he was mentally undone at the prospect of reliving them. His self-immolation could be seen as an extreme symptom of dramatic fear and hopelessness, completely panic-driven. It's impossible to diagnose at a distance, that's for sure. But it does show that some veterans would go to fatal lengths when the worst possibilities closed in all around them. But we must also consider how ordinary Roman soldiers might have fared. While we lack personal letters or diaries from the rank-and-file legionaries describing their torment, such writings are rare to begin with, to be honest, there are a few clues. For example, tombstone inscriptions sometimes speak of the hardships of long service. One retired centurion's epitaph mentioned that he, quote, lived as a soldier for 30 years and saw many horrors before retiring to a farm. Well, that hints at memories he carries, of course. Roman military doctors mainly dealt with physical injuries, you see, but there was an awareness of a nervous disease, the shocks that could affect health. Well, the Roman medical writer Galen discusses this, and he even mentions cases of people who died of fright or developed chronic illness from a scare. It is plausible that army physicians encountered troops with what we'd call panic attacks or depressive episodes, and tried treatments like herbal sedatives. Roman military tradition did include some practices that might alleviate trauma. One was the concept of decursus. After a battle, Roman troops would conduct a march or exercise to wind down and reorganize. This resembles a modern idea of decompression. Keep the troops busy and unified, so they don't dwell immediately on the carnage they've seen. Another practice was that victorious armies held triumphs and made offerings to the gods, which could also serve as a psychological closure of sorts. Soldiers in a triumph were hailed as heroes, and this public appreciation might help offset any private doubts or guilt. And then there was religious rites. Mars, the god of war, had to be ritually appeased after campaigns. A festival called Armilustrium was held in Rome each year to purify weapons and warriors, a sort of spiritual cleansing of the blood on them. Additionally, as noted earlier, sources claim that in some cases the Vestal virgins, priestesses of Vesta in Rome that is, performed a ceremonial bathing of returning soldiers to wash away the corruption of war. This intriguing detail suggests that Romans literally tried to wash off the grime of combat from their men, and one can see how such a ritual, if practiced, would convey to soldiers that their community understood that they'd been through something polluting and wanted to restore them to civic life. But despite these measures, it's likely that many Roman veterans just struggled in quiet. Consider the sheer number of wars. The legions were almost constantly engaged on some frontier, and some soldiers served up to 25 years, seeing repeated bloody engagements. Ancient commentators noted phenomena we'd now link to combat stress. For example, after the horrific Battle of Cannae in 216, where tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed by Hannibal's forces, the Roman state took measures to psychologically bolster survivors and the populace. They imposed mourning limits to prevent endless public mourning that could paralyze society, and they performed special religious rites to expiate the defeat. The trauma of the loss lingered in Rome's cultural memory for generations. Survivors of Cannae were initially shamed. They were formed into undersupplied legions and banished to Sicily for the remainder of the war as punishment for surviving a defeat. Which is telling, by the way. It shows a rather cruel approach. Those who lived through annihilation were stigmatized, as if they were kind of tainted. So you can only imagine the mental state of those survivors of Cannae, kept away from Rome because their defeat was seen as bad luck. They eventually redeemed themselves in later battles, but individually, we can't really be sure. Some may have carried nightmares onto the battlefield littered with 50,000 Roman corpses. Hard to push that to the back of your mind, that's for sure. But interestingly, even an ice-cold leader like Julius Caesar himself experienced possible stress reactions. There is an anecdote that after his great victory at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where he defeated his rival Pompey in the Roman Civil War, Caesar, upon surveying the battlefield with Roman dead, and that's from both sides, by the way, had an episode of trembling, and when he went back to his tent, he broke down into tears. Some sources say he was found crying and said something like, "They wanted this. After all I've accomplished, I would have been condemned had I lost." It hints at the emotional weight he felt, killing not so many just people, but fellow Romans. Caesar also suffered from episodes of what some think were epileptic seizures. Some historians speculate that these could have been stress-induced or psychosomatic in part, though most likely they were medical, that is, epileptic. Still, it is quite clear that even the most triumphant of generals felt the inner toil of the slaughter they witnessed, and sometimes the slaughter they caused. Another Roman figure to consider is Emperor Augustus, that is, Octavian also. After decades of civil war, Augustus established peace, that is, the Pax Romana, but sources tell us that he was certainly not free from personal ghosts. Suetonius, in his biography of Augustus, mentions Augustus experienced nightmares about his early battles, and sometimes would awaken in the middle of the night and wander the palace, unable to get any rest. He was known to be extremely reluctant to talk about certain painful events, like the loss of 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest, a disaster that haunted him. He was known to cry out, "Give me back my legions," in anguish. Augustus's case is one of a leader who won in the end, sure, but he suffered mental anguish, remembering the carnage and defeats. Overall, in Rome, we see a pretty complex picture. There's this cultural veneer of toughness and a tacit expectation to just get on with it. But underneath all that, there's the human reality. And that human reality every now and then comes out to assert itself. Some Romans, like Marius, succumbed to delayed traumatic stress. Others, like those nameless soldiers who likely drank or acted out, they must have had their struggles largely unrecorded, except when they manifested dramatically through violence or crime. The Romans, with their practical mindset, did implement rituals and rewards for veterans, land grants for retired soldiers. For instance, they gave many an incentive to focus on farming and family after service. A constructive outlet. Yet, just as today, not everyone adjusted so smoothly. The fact that we have a few candid stories of psychological breakdowns indicates that ancient observers noticed these patterns, even if they lacked a unified theory to explain them. But one thing is sure, whether it's 3,000 years ago, or all the way into the Vietnam War or current conflicts, once a soldier, always a soldier. And so, of course, the answer is pretty obvious. The question is, did ancient soldiers get PTSD? And the answer is yes. I suppose in everything, all but name. All the way from the Bronze Age up to the Roman Empire, we have those accounts of soldiers and veterans exhibiting the classic signs. But crucially, we got to remember that ancient societies, they didn't quite know how to deal with it, but they didn't ignore this phenomena. They may not have generalized into a medical diagnosis, but they recorded individual cases and did the best they could to deal with them. The concept that war could wound the mind was present implicitly, and in a world without modern science, people turned to what they knew: community, religion, ritual, to try and make sense of it all and help those afflicted. Of course, it's pretty poignant to think that a Greek hoplite returning from the Peloponnesian War could sit in an amphitheater and watch a play like Heracles and Ajax, and perhaps feel, wow, he's just like me. I'm not alone. Even those legendary heroes, they felt the same as I do. Well, that's a validation and comfort that stretches across millennia, that's for sure. And so with that, we reach the end of the video for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you came away with a better understanding of the issue. So I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neurona, Darren, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftus, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Catty B, Lovely, Boma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, and Rosie. All right, well, thank you once again for joining me. It's been, well, always a pleasure to have you with me. And there's plenty more videos to come. Okay, I'm looking forward to doing more like this. Anything you want to see, just tell me in the comments and we will start planning it out, I guess. Well, of course, lots of love to you all. Thank you for listening. And I will see you whenever you feel inclined to return. You know exactly where I'll be, right here on YouTube. Farewell for now.